The thread lay hidden within the fibers. What kind of fibers? And why was this difference the line between life and death? In the time of Jesus, 2,000 years ago, clothes were nothing like we imagine today. For centuries, we have pictured his garments as simple versions of modern textiles, but the reality was harsher, more meaningful, and far more fragile. Every piece of fabric required days of patient labor. Every color came from months of waiting, and every garment meant not just protection, but identity, status, and survival. Clothes in Jesus' time were not the result of personal choice. They were the visible expression of social order. People learned what they could wear from the moment they were born. Color, fabric quality, and style silently declared who a person was and where they stood in the community. This was not about fashion. This was about identity. Most people wore the same types of fabrics throughout their lives: linen, wool, and sometimes cotton. These fabrics were woven at home, with patience, in the hands of women. Looms were simple but functional. Threads required attention that demanded perseverance and endurance. Weaving a single piece could take months. Mistakes could not be undone. Every piece was valuable because every piece meant labor. This labor was not merely technical, it was also deep social organization. Young girls learned to weave because it increased their marriage value. Older women passed down knowledge because this knowledge meant family survival. Men sheared wool, spun thread, and ensured fabric could be traded in the outside world. Clothing was the concrete result of social cooperation. But even in this long process, everything began with raw materials. And these materials in Jesus' region were governed by specific rules, because what could be worn was not only limited by what was available, but also controlled by religious law. Palestine's climate largely determined clothing choices. Linen was the preferred fabric for hot summer months. It breathed, absorbed sweat, and cooled the body. But linen was expensive and required specific growing conditions. Flax needed rich soil and careful attention. Not every family could afford pure linen garments. Most relied on coarser weaves, mixed fibers, and whatever could be obtained through trade or local production. Wool served a different purpose. In the cold nights of Galilee, when temperatures dropped and stone walls offered little protection from the wind, wool meant the difference between warmth and dangerous cold. Sheep were valuable, not just for their meat and milk, but for their fleece. Shearing happened once a year, and families planned their clothing needs around this single harvest. Nothing was wasted. Even the shortest fibers were spun into usable thread. Cotton existed, but remained rare and costly. Most people encountered it only through trade with distant regions. For the common family, cotton was a luxury far beyond reach. Daily clothing consisted of what could be produced locally, with materials that grew in familiar soil or grazed on familiar hills. But the choice of fabric was only the beginning, because once the material was ready, it had to be transformed into something that could actually be worn. And this transformation revealed another layer of meaning, another set of rules that governed every thread. The process of turning fiber into clothing happened in stages, each requiring different skills and different amounts of time. First came the spinning. Women worked with simple spindles, twisting fiber into continuous thread. This was work done while walking, while talking, while watching children. Hands stayed busy while life continued around them. The rhythm was steady, meditative, and essential. Once enough thread accumulated, weaving could begin. Looms were set up in homes, often in courtyards where light was good and space allowed the stretching of long threads. The work required concentration. Each pass of the shuttle had to be precise. Tension needed to remain consistent. A single mistake could weaken the entire cloth or create visible flaws that marked the fabric as inferior. The weaving process also determined the pattern and quality of the final garment. Simple weaves created basic cloth, suitable for daily wear. More complex patterns required greater skill and more time, producing fabrics that carried higher value and social meaning. The most intricate work was reserved for special occasions, religious ceremonies, or garments that would last for years. Color came last, and color carried the deepest meaning of all. Natural dyes were extracted from plants, insects, and minerals found in the region. Purple came from murex shells, gathered along the Mediterranean coast. Red came from madder root. Blue came from indigo, or woad. Yellow came from saffron, or turmeric. Each color required different preparation, different mordants, and different levels of skill. The most expensive dyes created the most vivid colors. Deep purple, bright red, and pure blue were signs of wealth and status. These colors did not fade quickly and remained vibrant even after years of wear. Poor families relied on cheaper dyes that produced muted tones and faded rapidly under the Palestinian sun. But beyond economics, color carried religious significance. Certain combinations were reserved for priests. Others marked religious festivals or life passages. The fringes commanded by Mosaic law needed to include a thread of blue, connecting the wearer to divine commandments through visible reminder. Nothing about clothing was neutral. Once fabric was woven and dyed, the actual construction of garments began, and this construction followed patterns that had remained unchanged for generations. Patterns that determined not only how clothes looked, but how they functioned in daily life. The basic garment for both men and women was the tunic. This was a simple, rectangular piece of cloth with holes cut for the head and arms. It hung loose, allowing air to circulate in hot weather while providing coverage and modest protection. The length varied according to the wearer's status and occupation. Laborers wore shorter tunics that allowed freedom of movement. Those of higher rank wore longer garments that demonstrated their freedom from physical work. Over the tunic came the cloak or mantle. This outer garment served multiple purposes. During the day, it protected from sun and dust. At night, it became a blanket. On the road, it carried provisions and tools. In religious settings, it could be drawn over the head for prayer. The cloak was often the most valuable piece of clothing a person owned, carefully maintained, and passed down through generations. Sandals protected the feet from stones and thorns, but many people went barefoot most of the time. Leather was expensive and required specialized skills to prepare. Most sandals were simple affairs. A sole attached with leather straps, designed for durability rather than comfort. The wealthy might own multiple pairs, but the poor made do with whatever protected their feet, enough to allow travel and work. Head coverings served practical and social functions. Men wore simple caps or wound cloth around their heads for protection from sun and dust. Women covered their hair according to custom and modesty requirements. The style and quality of head coverings indicated marital status, age, and social position. Nothing was arbitrary. Every detail carried meaning recognized by the community. These garments, simple as they appear, created a complex language of social communication, and within this language, subtle differences separated comfort from hardship, security from vulnerability. Seen from a distance, many people appeared similarly dressed, the same basic shapes, the same general colors, the same essential coverings. But closer examination revealed crucial differences that determined quality of life. Everything began with the quality of materials used. Wealthy families could afford fine linen, woven from the best flax, prepared with care and skill. Poor families made do with coarser cloth, hastily woven from inferior fibers. The difference was not merely aesthetic. Fine cloth lasted longer, provided better protection, and maintained its appearance through repeated washing and wear. Poor cloth wore thin quickly, tore easily, and soon looked shabby despite careful maintenance. In a world where appearances mattered, this difference affected how people were perceived and treated by others. Thread count determined warmth and durability. Tightly woven fabrics kept out wind and retained heat during cold nights. Loosely woven cloth allowed drafts and provided inadequate protection when temperatures dropped. In Galilee's winter months, this could mean the difference between comfort and real suffering. The quality of dyes revealed another gap. Rich families used expensive colorants that produced vibrant, lasting colors. Poor families relied on cheap dyes that faded quickly, leaving clothes looking worn and drab. Color was not decoration. It was a statement of resources and social position. But perhaps the cruelest difference lay in quantity. Some families owned multiple garments for different seasons and occasions. They could wash one set while wearing another, replace worn items before they became rags, and maintain their appearance regardless of circumstances. Poor families often owned only what they wore. Washing meant going without clothes until everything dried. Damage meant continuing to wear torn or patched garments until they fell apart completely. This scarcity affected health and social standing. Inadequate clothing led to illness during cold weather. Shabby appearance limited opportunities for work and marriage. The cycle of poverty was woven into the very fabric people wore on their backs. It was within this reality that certain teachings about clothing gained concrete meaning. When Jesus spoke of not worrying about what to wear, he addressed people for whom clothing was a daily concern, a constant calculation of resources and need. These were not abstract spiritual lessons, but practical wisdom for people who knew firsthand the burden of scarcity. And yet, beyond all these material concerns, clothing carried spiritual significance that touched every thread and every weave. Because in the world Jesus knew, what people wore connected them, not only to social order, but to divine commandment. Jewish law prescribed specific requirements for clothing. The fringes were not optional decorations, but commanded reminders of covenant relationship. Mixed fabrics were forbidden. Wool and linen could not be woven together. This rule served practical purposes, but also carried symbolic meaning about maintaining distinctions and avoiding confusion. Clothing also marked religious observance. Special garments were worn for Sabbath and festivals. Prayer shawls carried sacred significance. Priestly garments followed detailed specifications given in ancient law. What people wore to worship said as much about their faith as what they said in prayer. Modesty requirements shaped daily choices. Both men and women dressed to cover their bodies appropriately, avoiding any appearance that might be considered provocative or inappropriate. These standards were not arbitrary rules, but community agreements about dignity and respect. Purity laws affected how clothing was handled. Certain conditions required washing of garments as well as bodies. Contact with death, disease, or ritual impurity meant clothing needed cleansing before normal community life could resume. Practical hygiene and spiritual symbolism were woven together in daily practice. It was in this context that the seamless robe of Jesus gained such significance. Here was a garment valuable enough to cast lots over, woven without seam from top to bottom. The detail was not incidental, but pointed to something deeper about identity, value, and the way divine purpose was expressed even in simple cloth. When we look closely at clothing in the time of Jesus, we discover that it was never merely about covering the body. Every thread carried labor. Every color carried meaning. Every garment carried identity. Jesus grew up wearing clothes that required patience to make, wisdom to maintain, and community to provide. Understanding this world changes how we read his teachings about clothing, worry, and provision. He spoke as someone who knew the weight of fabric on tired shoulders, the value of a cloak in cold wind, the vulnerability of having little to wear, and nowhere to wash it safely. The Incarnation included this reality. The Son of God wore clothes that represented human skill, human need, and human community. He felt the texture of homespun wool, the coolness of linen, the protection of a simple cloak under Palestinian skies. To conclude, reflect. As we observe clothing in the time of Jesus, we realize it was not merely covering, but communication. Every garment spoke of relationships, resources, and place in the world. Jesus wore this language fluently, understanding both its limitations and its meanings. The Christian faith is born from complete incarnation. Christ did not avoid the material world but entered it fully, wearing its clothes, knowing its textures, understanding its weight. This same incarnational faith calls us to see the spiritual significance of simple things, the divine presence in daily needs. And if this documentary strengthened your faith and expanded your understanding of the Bible, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. Your support helps us explore the world that shaped the Savior and discover how ancient realities still speak to modern hearts. Until the next video, may God bless you.